Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rapidly Securing Medical Devices in Small Hospitals. My name is Chad Holmes, and I will be your presenter today. Before we jump right into things, a little bit about myself and then a little bit about Cynerio. First of all, my name again is Chad Holmes. I am a cybersecurity evangelist for Cynerio, meaning I get to talk with a lot of really smart people, find out what they're doing within our organization, within our customers, and then help others learn by presenting them what they do, kind of like today. Throughout my career, I've had a couple different focus areas. I started by making things. I was a software developer coming out of school. And while I was making those things, I started finding a lot of security issues, which were really, really nasty. So I didn't like how they were being handled. Effectively, they weren't being handled at all. So I started breaking things, not in a bad guy way, but in a way to help people fix the things that I was breaking. By the way, they were paying me to break them, so I wasn't doing it illegally. As I did that, I started to find that there were a lot of really, really smart people in network security and networks and security development teams and things like that that just didn't have an introduction to security. So I started to teach people how to do what I was doing. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about the research we've been doing into small hospital environments and see some of the challenges that we've been finding in those environments. We'll then start talking about different approaches for minimizing the attack surface of those small hospital environments. I'll give you some guidance on what you can do kind of midterm and long term, but also what you can start doing today, even if it's just talking with your teams, and then answer any questions you have. So if you have questions, plop them in that little question bar on the side, and I'll answer them at the very end. A little bit about Cynerio. Cynerio was started in 2017, and we had a simply stated goal. We want to secure every IoT, OT, and medical device in healthcare environments. And as you might expect, while that goal is easy to say, it's really, really hard to do, right? There are millions and millions of devices. There's all kinds of different issues that we need to secure. 2020 was a really big year for us. Beyond the excitement of the pandemic that we're all still dealing with, we were named a Forrester Wave Leader in 2020. And we were also named a Gartner Cool Vendor. So we really took a turn where our technology started to really get a lot of adoption and a lot of attention. On the back of that, over the last year and a half or so, we've started to really ramp up our expansion kind of worldwide. So we're expanding from the dozens of customers we had at the time to hundreds and thousands, and hopefully someday soon, every hospital across the world so we can help protect their environments. So what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit what we're seeing with our small hospital customers and how you might be able to learn from that. So what we're going to do today is first we'll start with the small hospital landscape. I always like to start with a little bit of kind of level setting and vocabulary, so we're all on the same page about what I'm actually talking about. From there, we'll start talking about the threat landscape and why that landscape exists, areas you can investigate around it. I'll then go to who can help, because all too often you can go to a presentation or go listen to someone or talk with someone and they say, here are all the problems. Good luck. We want to do more than that. We want to give you some guidance. Naturally, some of that guidance will be what we can do, but it's also what we're seeing our customers do with other technologies, other partners, other approaches, and what we're seeing people outside of our customers do as well. I'll throw in some additional considerations, again, give you some guidance on how you can start taking action today, and then, of course, do Q&A at the end. So again, plop those questions in there and I'll answer them in 45 minutes or so. So first, let's talk a little bit about the small hospital landscape. For the sake of today's discussion, I'm going to use anything with under 200 beds as a small hospital. And that accounts for about 75% of hospitals in the United States. If we up that level to 300 beds, that accounts for about 85%. But for today we'll focus on 200 beds or less. A lot of what I'll talk about is rural hospitals. Now, not all small hospitals are rural hospitals, but the overwhelming majority are. It's about 80% of small hospitals are rural. There are some differences between urban and rural in some cases, but they're pretty small. So if you have any questions about that, just let me know. But again, small hospitals, 200 beds, mostly in rural communities. And one of the things we're going to talk about is why there's such a huge increase in attacks on small hospitals. In fact, in the second half of 2020, so about kind of 9 months ago, 9 to 10 months ago, there was a report that came out that there was a 580% increase in cyber attacks on small hospitals in the second half of that year. And we want to talk a little bit about the reasons why and why it's such a big threat, and that 70% of all cyber attacks in the healthcare industry are focused on small hospitals. So there's a lot of threats out there. There's a lot of issues that you're seeing that you have to find new ways to defend against, and hopefully ways that you can roll out rather quickly. There are, of course, additional challenges for small hospitals that maybe some bigger hospitals don't face and that other industries certainly don't face. First of all, it can often be missed that small hospitals have to operate in a space where there's diseconomies of scale, meaning, the average hospital, kind of to be the most efficient it can be, it's recommended it's between 300 and 600 beds, 300 and 600 beds. In reality, small hospitals are often counted in the dozens of beds, right? Maybe 100, maybe 200. So they face kind of natural diseconomies of scale that we'll talk about. That leads to a naturally higher overhead, right? There's baseline costs all over the place that they have to address. And because they don't have the scale, there's just a higher overhead they have to deal with. They often find that the communities they operate in see a higher rate of emergency rooms being used as primary care sources, which changes both the care model that they provide, as well as some of the financial model and revenue models that help keep the doors open. They also tend to see an over-reliance on government payers, which changes a lot of the financial aspects. And then finally, we're going to talk about a lot of the staff challenges they see today, because the staffing challenges faced by rural communities in particular are vastly different, both in terms of the medical industry and other industries out there. And if we understand those a little bit more, we can understand some of the challenges that are being faced. And to understand some of these challenges, we have to start with the baseline of the healthcare industry as a whole. The healthcare industry, unfortunately, has an incredibly vulnerable footprint when it comes to medical devices in particular, as well as other technology. Within the United States, and most of this research is US-based, but the rates that we use will translate very nicely to other regions. So, for example, in the US, we know that there's about 5 million devices that are operational. They're connected to patients, they're providing care, they're doing whatever they need to do to help people get healthier, but they have critical vulnerabilities, right? To put that another way, there's roughly 1 million beds in the United States. So for every hospital bed in the United States, there's 5 devices close by that have a critical vulnerability. And that's terrifying when you start to think, well, my system has 50 beds, that's 250 devices that have an issue, right? So these devices are all over the place. They're doing what they need to in terms of care, but they're also introducing a lot of risk. We also see that these devices, again, regardless of the size of the facility, are handling data in the form of EPHI, which is incredibly valuable. Now, if you go back and you look at an article that we published 5 or 6 months ago, we state that PHI is worth kind of 3 to 5 times more than credit cards. In reality, this number has changed drastically over the last 6 months. And a recent report came out and said EPHI data is actually far more valuable in the black market than anyone realized. It's about 20x higher. So a credit card record will sell for kind of $10 to $20, somewhere in that range. PHI data will sell for $250 to $500, much, much higher. And the reason for that is actually pretty obvious once you look at the data. If you have my credit card information, you have my card number, my expiration date, my CVV, maybe my name, maybe my address, all that stuff. A lot of that stuff can be easily changed. I can't change my name all that easily. I can't change my address, but I can cancel my credit card, all that stuff. Instead, if you look at my medical records, it has my name, maybe my social security number, my current address, probably a lot of my past addresses, my parents' information, their past addresses, all our healthcare records, maybe my siblings' information, just a wealth of information that when you're committing fraud, when you're trying to be a bad guy, that can be used and is much more valuable in your kind of malicious activities. So healthcare environments as a whole now have all these devices that have all these vulnerabilities. They're interacting with really, really valuable data, so they become a target-rich environment. And then they're often operating in environments where there is no monitoring of network traffic. We've seen about 75% of hospitals have incredibly flat network with limited to no monitoring of the traffic going back and forth. Meaning attackers can very easily go into those environments, sit in them for months and quarters and seasons and sometimes years, and just collect information before kind of triggering the final attack of encrypting your systems or whatever they want to do. So healthcare as a whole is an incredibly incredibly weak environment that attackers have identified over the last 18 months and started to really, really hit hard. Now, for small hospitals, there are compounding factors that make the threat landscape even worse. The first is staff availability. And I have yet to talk to a small hospital, particularly in rural communities, where they said, oh, we have all the talent we'll ever need. We have every nurse we'd ever want, every doctor, every IT staff member, whatever. The reality is that in these communities, it's often a very limited talent pool, just a smaller number of people. The IT and security folks are often transient, meaning they may come in for just a couple of years at a time and then hop to the next opportunity that comes to them. And this leads to accelerated departures, right? So it makes for a really, really hard challenge to actually go and staff teams that stay together for a while and build these really good secure systems. Additionally, hospitals have to operate in a care-first environment. That's the whole goal of hospitals. This is not a criticism. This is kind of stating the obvious. They want to provide care first, and they only stand up IT systems and security systems because they help provide better care. So the care-first mindset helps accomplish the primary goal, but it also leads to an environment where corrections have to be retroactive. They are often done in response to something. So, hey, we got attacked, or we noticed a cyber attack, therefore we have to improve our practices. And this can result in a huge amount of technical and security debt. Right? We've all heard about technical debt. We've all heard a little bit about security debt. But small hospitals see those much more because they have to pick and choose where the resources go. And very much more often it goes to care than kind of the underlying infrastructure that helps protect that care. And then finally, we have those diseconomies of scale that we mentioned earlier. Hospitals have fewer resources. Those resources have to provide more effort to get the job done. And at the end of the day, they have to be much more productive than they may be in other environments. Again, whether it's bigger hospitals or other industries. So ultimately, small hospitals have a big target, which then has an even bigger target put on it because of all of the challenges they face around both providing care and securing the environments that provide that care. And the results are increasingly devastating. And if any of you know me, you know I love hyperbole, at least to some degree. But in this case, devastating is not hyperbole. What we see in healthcare environments when there is an attack, it's just a compounding set of issues that lead to bigger and bigger issues. So first, we know last year that there were at least 400 small hospitals that got hit by a cyber attack, right? Meaning the attack was fully executed. They either had to pay a lot of money to recover or they paid a ransom or whatever the case may be. That's roughly 10% of the small hospitals in the United States. And we expect that this number is going to continue to grow over the next couple of years. We also know that when those attacks happen, they often lead to shutdowns. And the shutdown may just be appointments canceled for a couple hours. It could be appointments canceled for a couple months. It could be full shutdown of the only hospital within 30 miles for a month or two at a time. So we start to see not only are the attacks happening, but they're leading to real impact on the ground, which is hospital shutdowns. To recover from the attacks, really tough financial decisions have to be made. You know, ransoms are often in the $1 million range. The kind of the low end is $250,000. The high end is $1.5 million. That's a really tough pill to swallow. You know, no one wants to give the bad guys $1 million and hope they restore their systems. But at the same time, to recover from these attacks, it often costs tens of millions of dollars, right? The more publicized ones average about $50 million. People that are considered lucky in recovery spend about $10 million to recover. And even then, you can't really account for the community impact that happens here. So when we shut the doors, we know there's obvious community impact. You know, people are being diverted to other hospitals. But if you look at rural communities and the additional influence and impact they have on the community, hospitals have on the community, it's a much, much bigger deal. Take a look at where I grew up in kind of rural Maine. There's only 3 industries in rural Maine. There's a shoe factory, there's a hospital, and there's a paper mill. If you shut down one of those 3 things, not only are you denying that community of care, you're also taking somewhere between 10 and 20% of the entire community economy completely out of the cycle. And that has really, really negative cascading effects as well. So when these attacks happen, it's not just about, oh no, there's an issue that we need to fix. It ripples throughout the community to a very large degree. And kind of the worst thing about all of this is if you address all these issues, if you make sure you've done everything you can not to get attacked, you're minimizing shutdown time when you do get attacked, you're making sure that you have some kind of insurance or fund to deal with ransomware, whatever the case may be, there's still no guarantee that you're not going to get attacked. The biggest thing I can point to here is there's a pattern going on within ransomware attackers where they will go in, they'll attack a system, they'll wait for you to recover if you don't pay the ransom, and then they'll attack you based on other vulnerabilities they found. So it can be incredibly frustrating to say, hey, I can do all these practices and still be a target. Where should I start, or why should I start? Why not just GIM? And that's kind of what we're here to help you with today is figure out where you can best invest your resources, your time, your team to get the most protection possibly available. And so up until, a couple months ago, when we would have this discussion, people would say, we're doing all these security practices. We have these cloud application protections in place. We have all kinds of phishing training. We're securing this, we're securing that. Where else should we spend our money? And to what degree should we spend our money? So, and that was always a hard discussion because, Cynerio, I'll talk about what we do in a second, but we're focused on devices. We want to make sure that your devices are secure and not introducing risk. And if you had asked someone back in July, how much risk do devices actually present, they'd probably guess 1 or 2% or so. In reality, a study came out in September. It was done by the Pwnymon Institute, sponsored by Sensinet. It's an awesome study. I'll have the link. You have it there, but I'll have it in the deck as well. And what I would recommend is you read it all because there's a lot of good nuggets in there. But one thing it showed was the root cause of attacks during the COVID pandemic for ransomware. Effectively, where are attackers going and why are they going there? And what it found was cloud applications were still kind of the leader with phishing close behind them. But then device security and device issues were at the same level as phishing. And that's something no one expected. Even us who deal with it every day thought we'd be up there, but not on the same par as phishing. So the reality is when you look at the practices you have in place right now and you look at what you're securing and how much you're spending and how much time you're spending on it, you probably already doing a lot of activity around cloud applications and phishing and on-prem applications, but you're probably not focusing too much on device security or API security or some of the other stuff which require a really strong incident response. And so what we're starting to see our customers do and kind of the broader community do is take a step back, realize they've made really good progress on phishing, for example, right? Everyone goes through phishing training. You get those kind of random emails sent to you to trick you into clicking a link. That stuff is already in place, and you're spending a lot of time and money making sure that phishing isn't going to lead to an attack. But if you really want to focus on where's the best bang for the buck, it may be in the medical and IoT device security space because they account for almost a quarter of attacks, and you're probably doing very, very little around that. Now, the other question I get about this slide is it's presented as, what can I do about those other sections? And what the real question is, oh no, I haven't done almost anything on there. Who can I go to for help? So what we've done is we've actually thrown together this really, really ugly slide. And I apologize for the ugliness. The intent here is not for us to go through each one today. Take out your phone, take a photo, because this is probably going to come in useful at some point. The reality is there are tons of security vendors out there that have healthcare specific functionality that help address the ransomware space, right? You see IBM all over the place there. AWS is obviously in the cloud space, all kinds of different folks. The intent for this slide is to give you a place to at least start researching the vendors available to you and the resources available to you to start securing every part of that report that I was talking about. And of course, Cynerio, we're right there in the middle. We're the leaders in IoT and medical devices, so we're glad to help you there. But if you're at a point where you're still scratching your head, you're not quite sure where to start, let us know. We'll gladly walk you through this chart and give you guidance on who we've worked with in the past and who might best fit your needs. So now let's shift a little bit from kind of the overall problem statement to how can you actually start addressing the security issues you see. We all know there's attacks. We all know it's doom and gloom, kind of painted that picture. So I'm going to start at a bit more theoretical level first, right? In the theory here is that you should enable a zero trust approach. And zero trust is one of those concepts that's really, really easy to state, but again, really hard to put in place. So at its basis, zero trust means that you don't trust anything by default. You don't trust communications. You don't trust devices. Everything is validated in some way before that data is used in any way. And as you might imagine, actually putting that in place is a really, really difficult task. We've seen a lot of customers will go and they'll put VLANs in place, so kind of little neighborhoods within their network, and think, okay, we've kind of isolated devices to some degree. That's going to protect us from attack. And the reality is traffic can still bounce between VLANs. It can bounce around within VLANs. So it's a good start, but it only gives you a tiny, tiny layer of protection. More practically, what we're seeing is that people that take a segmentation or micro-segmentation approach are addressing a lot more risk than any other step when it comes to network security within the healthcare environments. In fact, taking a segmentation approach will address nearly 70% of the risks in hospitals. One great stat that I really love is 40% of device level risks cannot be fully patched. They have old operating systems, they have old technology. You just can't patch it. There is no fix for it. But if you sufficiently limit the traffic to only what that device needs and only the devices it connects to, then you can make sure that if in the event that there's an attack, it only bounces to one or two or three devices, not hundreds and thousands. And so this microsegmentation approach is becoming incredibly valuable. The challenge there is a microsegmentation approach can be an incredibly heavy lift. There's a lot of time and effort, and that's where kind of our technology comes in and helps you automate that. I'll talk about that in a second. The additional side benefit of this approach is that when you're identifying all the risks of an environment and you're seeing who communicates with what and how they do it, you also start to identify what the clinical workflow of traffic is, right? So often you'll see radiology devices only communicating within the radiology department, as would make sense. So as you start to understand that workflow and you see radiology kind of reaching out to, let's say, oncology, that's abnormal. And so what we can do is, beyond putting the security layers in place through microsegmentation, we can also start to alert you if there are odd communication patterns that may say, hey, there's an active attacker in here. Let's go ahead and address it. So there's this additional layer of not only protecting your environment, but knowing more about your environment and then putting additional alerts in place. In the way that Cynerio does this specifically, we split into two specific pieces of functionality. The first one I really like talking about is called attack detection and response. And I like talking about it for two reasons. One is it's a cool technology, and I'll get to why it's cool in a second. But two, how we created this is a really neat story. So effectively, this was customer-driven innovation. We were working on an engagement with a customer. We went in and we found malware, right? It wasn't kind of what the engagement was around, but we clearly found malware with our technology, went to our customer and said, hey, there's something nasty happening here. We need to address this as soon as possible. And the customer said, okay, give us a second. They went back to their other vendors thinking they had some kind of service around addressing this malware. And the vendor said, yeah, you do. If you want to give us this exorbitant amount of money, we'll gladly roll in a team and handle it. And our customer at the time said, we just don't have that money. We don't have that budget. Cynerio, what can you do to help? And so, being eager to please, we jumped in and we identified the sources of the malware, and we saw the 5 or 6 machines it was bouncing around on. We isolated and quarantined those machines, wiped them off, cleaned it up, did all the normal incident response stuff you would expect. And when the smoke cleared, one, the customer was happy, which is great. But more importantly, we stepped back and said, oh, we just did something really cool. We had a core technology that identified this. Then we built some scripts and built some procedures that actually allowed us to address the issues in a really quick way. And so we were able to take all those learnings and that core underlying technology and build attack detection and response. And effectively what happens is, whenever our technology is deployed, customers immediately start getting this passive scan of their network where we're identifying active attacks and alerting them to those active attacks. Now, hopefully nothing is found, but when it's found, the alerts come out quickly. We're able to identify them and quarantine them incredibly rapidly. So when you have those environments where there is no real monitoring of network traffic, this is what that does. It allows us to find all those attacks in an ongoing basis. So it's more of a reactive layer if there's an active attack, but it's something that lets people know what's going on. It's a really cool case study in how customers like yourself can drive your vendors to innovate. Now, on top of that, or I should say below that, is our more traditional technology, our rapid risk reduction approaches. And now rapid risk reduction sounds a little bit like marketing, FUD, but the reality is we can do things incredibly quickly compared to the more manual tasks that we've seen in the past. The first thing we do is north, south, and east, west segmentation. So again, effectively, this is taking down and reducing communication patterns between devices, between technologies in your environments to make sure they're only communicating with what they need to. And again, this covers about 70% of all issues that we find in hospital networks. So we go from 0 to 70 incredibly quickly. We roll this out within a couple of days. We're identifying risk. Within a couple of weeks or months, we're actually addressing that risk in a very productive way. Now, the way we do that is a lot of times by creating policies and pushing to your network systems. And the objection we always get is, yeah, but won't that impact functionality? Which is a completely valid objection. We can't do anything that will impact patient care through devices or otherwise. So what we've built on top of our segmentation tools is a segmentation analysis layer. And what we do is when we create the policies in that first step, we will actually run analysis against those policies based on your network traffic. We won't do it in a live environment. We don't want to interfere with your network, so we'll do it in a virtualized environment. And then we'll identify any exceptions to the rules we have in place. And what that does is it allows us to present the exceptions to your team rather than the full policy set. So instead of your team getting 10,000 policies, for example, and having to approve and analyze every one, we might give them 15 exceptions that they might have to analyze and can do in an afternoon rather than an 18-month engagement. So the combination of segmentation and analysis of those segmentation policies is incredibly powerful. The other thing that we do is a combination of service hardening and vendor access control. Effectively, your devices at some point will need to reach outside your network, or someone outside your network, like a vendor, will need to reach in to monitor them, maintain them, what have you. We want to make sure those communications are limited to only what they need to do. So for example, all those radiology devices that are browsing Facebook on a daily basis, or that have a service that hit a malware server, both are very common and very horrifying. We're going to make sure that we identify those and kind of trim the permissions back so they're only hitting those external services that they need. On the other end, if you have someone that's monitoring your devices remotely, updating them, maintaining them, it's incredibly common. It's usually done over a secure link, but we want to make sure that if they get breached, you don't get breached. So we have vendor access controls to help prevent that. So ultimately what we do is we roll in, we work with your network team, and we improve your security drastically within the first couple of weeks that we're there, and then shift to a business as usual model over the next several months and quarters. What we've also done is we've heard a lot of feedback from small hospitals that say, hey, this can all be intimidating. We have a small team. We're not sure what to do. We can't waste months and months and months rolling this out. What can you do to help? So we've created a Cynerio Now offering, which is more a business packaging of the technologies we have. So you get the same level of support and technology you always have. The core Cynerio Now offering comes with training. It comes with technical staff to help with rollout. It comes with everything you need to make sure your team is successful in deploying it. Now, the reality is a lot of our customers need help with their team. They have a really good team. It's a core set of people that, are busting their rear ends, but they're overloaded already and they can't be tasked with even more practices. They just don't have the time or the energy to do it. So we also offer Cynerio Now with TAM support. So it will come with our technical account managers, customer success managers, support team, all the people you need to make that transition to your team incredibly quick. So instead of it becoming a full-time job for a full cybersecurity rollout, your team is used only when absolutely needed, and our team is there to help guide them along the process. And that, as you might imagine, is an incredibly valuable offering to many of our customers. Now, a couple things that you can do starting today now that I've plugged our offerings, which are oh so great. First, let's talk a little bit about upgrading your security approach. And most of the things on this page are based on what we found, we've heard from colleagues, from other vendors, from analysts, things like that. So these are not scenario specific, but they're things that everyone says we wish hospitals knew. And the first thing is that there's a great opportunity to learn from other industries and how they've addressed ransomware. And this is driven by collaboration, not competition. So if you look at how The oil and gas industry has handled ransomware, the Colonial Pipeline attack, for example, that happened earlier this year. Or if you look at how pharmaceuticals have handled it, the Merck breach that happened a few years ago and cost well over $1 billion with a B dollars. In those cases, those organizations actually communicated with their competitors. They went out and they said, this is how we got attacked. This is how we had to recover. This is what we can do as an industry to improve. And the reason they did that is they realized it was better off to have an industry-wide response to better protect the entire industry and protect the revenue flow than to kind of hide in the shadows and just hope it didn't happen to them again. And so what I've heard over and over from analysts and people within healthcare is encourage people to find a community. It doesn't have to be a public forum. If it is, awesome. It'll help a wider group of people learn. But find a community where you can talk to your peers and understand the steps they're taking and the challenges they're facing, because you can share tips on how to improve yourselves based on each other's experience. So really, really encourage a more open discussion rather than just kind of hiding in the shadows and hoping nothing happens. And you do have the added benefit that small hospitals in particular, they rarely compete, right? Small hospitals are geographically isolated in many, many cases. So you don't have to worry about losing someone to the small hospital down the road. They're not going to drive that extra hour to go there. You're in their backyard. They're going to go there. So you have the advantage over other industries where you're not competing with your collaborators there. So identify ways to find a more collaborative approach. Next is start thinking about ways to enhance your team. And I want to be very clear. This is not lay off your team. It's not get rid of your team. You probably have a team that is really, really good at what they do and know your environment incredibly well. And you probably also have a lot of open headcounts that you can't fill. So what I would encourage you to do is start identifying how you can reduce IT burden with things like MSPs, managed service providers, or MSSPs, managed security service providers. Because what you'll find is quite often they have reasonable prices for really high levels of expertise that they can roll out really quickly. So they can respond to incidences, but they can also roll out long-term plans that may actually reduce your costs in some cases. Also, start thinking about how you're going to respond if there is a spike in some way, right? We all know that there are emergency procedures in place if there are things like a COVID response, right? Where there's an outbreak and you need to set up tents and triage and all that stuff. Start investigating things like hospitals in a box. These are really cool technologies where you can stand up a hospital network infrastructure, which is isolated and allows you to keep providing critical care to the ICU and emergency room and other places while you handle a bigger ongoing attack. It's a really cool offering. I'll have a link at the end. Again, not something we offer. It's not a partner thing. It's just something you should consider that a lot of people have talked about. And then start thinking about how the shift to remote work may open up a larger talent pool for you. We're seeing more and more hospitals want to have people in as much as possible, but in reality, they have a lot of remote workers now, particularly on the IT side, the non-caregiver side. And so start looking at where you may be able to hire outside your traditional geographic range to boost your team. Prices might be a little bit different, sometimes cheaper, sometimes more expensive. But the reality is you can now choose from a broader pool and a broader set of expertise. And then finally, start investigating merging best practices. One thing we hear from customers over and over is, I started an inventory project 3 years ago. We now have this really accurate inventory, but we have no idea where to start with security. We found some issues, but we have no suggestions on what we should do to fix them. They're just kind of there. And so remember, inventory is not security. One of the really cool things we do is we find all those risks and we give you guidance on how to address them, and we give you policy, but we also give you this really rich, really accurate, really quick set of inventory of all the devices we found. It's just that was never really our goal. It's a really great, valuable byproduct, and it's kind of where others end. It's just kind of a step on the broader security journey for us. Also, start learning about industry alerts and attack patterns. One of the favorite groups that I have is called Cyber Health Working Group. It's done in conjunction with the US FBI, available at intelligence.healthcare. They send out daily briefings about active attacks that are happening, changing attack patterns, things like that. You can read these in the course of 5 to 10 minutes max per day. They're very straightforward, very easy to read. But find groups like this that will allow you to understand what attackers are doing, particularly in healthcare, particularly in your environment, so you can learn from others. The other really good thing about that group is they have forums that are rather well moderated. So vendors like me can't go in and say, hey, we're the best. Instead, it's a really productive discussion between members saying, hey, have you ever done X or Y or Z? What challenges have you run into? Can you recommend something? And it is a great discussion place for people in the healthcare industry to share best practices. Really highly recommend it. And then finally, start asking your vendors, what can they do to help increase your workforce efficiency? Right? There's still people that have to roll out big projects, 40 to 50 hours a week, built at an hourly rate, all that stuff. But what we're seeing more and more is that vendors that have a specific set of expertise can make that expertise available in different ways. It doesn't have to be full-time consulting engagements. It can be, again, TAM or CSM models. It can be support models. Sometimes it's an hourly model. So start asking your vendors how they can help address the workforce issues you're having, because you might find that the pricing models and the deployment models are much different than they may have been even 12 or 18 months ago. So in addition to all these long-term and mid-term tasks that I'm giving you, we do have a couple things that you could do today to start taking action and working with your team. First is just have a chat, right? Go to your IT and security team, who typically own all security within hospitals from what we see, and ask them what they're doing around IoT or medical IoT or operation technology device security. Like we saw earlier, this is kind of the biggest gap that's out there. Now, you may find that they haven't really thought about it all that much, and that's fine. That's kind of normal, unfortunately. So ask them specifically, what gaps are there between IT and IoT best practices that you can start filling really quickly? Sometimes it's assumed that IT and IoT security practices are the same, and conceptually they are, but in practice, they're vastly different. So start working with your IT team to understand where you need to make progress really quickly. Next is to do a little bit of role playing. And it's not going to be fun, but it will be at least educational. I was talking with a reporter earlier this week, and he asked around this, what's the number one thing hospitals should do when they have an active cyber attack? And I was being a smart aleck, and I said, well, they should take out the printed incident response plan that they have at their desk and follow the steps. And he kind of chuckled and said, yeah, that's great if everyone had it. And if you don't, you might want to start developing it. But in reality, they should focus on patient care first. You should start developing an incident response plan. And one of the first things you should think about is, what happens when an attack hits me? What happens if I get hit by ransomware or we identify a cyber attack? Who am I going to call? Will I have their number in my phone? Do I have it written down someplace? What actions are going to be taken? Do a little bit of role playing. Find a trusted advisor that can help you build out that incident response plan. Also, look more at the business and financial side of things, because while we all want to focus on a care-first environment, there are financial realities that we all have to make sure we consider. So understand what level of downtime and recovery costs you can reasonably handle. Some of these attacks can go on for months and months, particularly if you don't pay the ransom, and can cost tens of millions of dollars, and kind of understand what impact that will have to your environment. Also, work with your cybersecurity insurance providers and understand what level of coverage they provide. We saw an attack on Scripps earlier this year out in Southern California, and it's cost them over $110 million, and their cybersecurity insurance only covered about $5 million of that. So really understand what coverages you have, because it may not be as big as most people think, and it certainly won't cover the full cost of a recovery from an attack. And then finally, if you have questions about any of this, contact our team, right? You can reach me directly at chad.holmes@cynerio.com. Will, who I reference here, works full-time with our small hospital customers. So he knows everything about everything when it comes to small hospitals. So if you have questions about our offerings and our Cynerio Now offerings for small hospitals, we'll gladly talk through those. If you're just not sure where to go and you need some best practices and you need advice, or you took a photo of that really ugly slide I showed you with all those vendors, reach out too. We'll be happy to give you advice, give you some guidance on what we've seen in the past, and hopefully help you kind of improve your security posture. So you can always reach out to us. We're on every major platform. These talks are recorded on Bright Talk. We have 3 or 4 other talks that talk about the emerging attack patterns, how much it costs when you're hacked, things like that. Those are on YouTube and Bright Talk right now, so I highly recommend you take a look at those. Also, I made a lot of references during today's presentation. So this slide deck is available in your attachments, as well as our Cynerio Now document. All of these are really interesting reading. They kind of back up those stats we have. I highly recommend that Ponemon Sentinel study. It is eye-opening when it comes to ransomware and understanding the challenge that we're all facing together here. So with that, let me go ahead and take a look at questions. Just one second. And feel free to plop any in there. All right, first one. How much do small hospitals typically spend on IT and security? How do the categories in that chart account for spend? Yeah, so right, I'm going to have come up with some numbers off the top of my head, so they might be a little bit off. What we typically see is that if you are a leading IT hospital, you're spending somewhere between 3 and 10% of your overall revenue on IT. Now, that is top 10 spending, right? I think that the top hospital spends about 10 or 11% a year. So let's say you're a top hospital, you're spending 3% of overall revenue. Security spend is then about 1 to 3% of that. So if you have $100 million in revenue, the typical spend is somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not a lot of money. So of course, we'd all like to see that go up across the board, but think of it as kind of 3% of 3% of revenue is the rule we see. And we'd like to see that go up higher. All right, next one. If a security event occurs that directly targets a healthcare device, how do you help send out a work order for our HTM team with remediation steps to correct the device? That is an awesome question. All right, I love it. So when we identify the attack, our system will alert it, and what we do is we integrate with whatever systems you have in place. So whatever your order system is, let's say ServiceNow, just for the sake of argument, we would integrate with ServiceNow. We would say, here's the issue we found, here's the IP address. In a lot of cases, we can actually tell you where in the hospital it is because we can identify where the network traffic is coming from and give you at least a pretty good proximity within a few dozen feet. So we will give all the information. The other thing we'll do is tell you not only what we've identified, but recommended steps for mitigating those. In some cases, it may just be go unplug that device right now and we'll figure out how to reset it entirely. In other cases, it may be let's go ahead and put these network policies in place. So it really depends on the type of attack. But we can automate that entire workflow right down to when the biomed engineer gets an alert on their phone where they have to go do something. So great question. Next one. How do you combine our healthcare device maintenance information, our CMS, with your network discovery inventory data? Yeah, same thing. So as you might imagine, most systems built today are highly functional in terms of integrations, right? They're exposing APIs. We can integrate with those APIs really well. So regardless of what your CMS system is, we haven't found one we can't integrate with pretty easily. So we integrate directly with it and then work within whatever constraints it has. That's one of the really nice features of being a nimble startup is whenever we find an edge case, we can develop around it really quickly. We don't have to really ask for a lot of changes from kind of the bigger systems that you already have in place. Next question is, can you elaborate more on vendors providing human help? Do those replace our team or are they typical consultant roles at hourly prices? No. So I'm not advocating for team replacement at all. What I consistently hear is we just can't find team members. One really good case study I heard was someone who just had constant turnover. And what he did to staff his IT team was he would go to the local, I think it was casino and grocery store and ask the management, who's the smartest person you have working here? They'd hire that person, train them up, knowing they'd leave in 2 to 3 years, and then just do it all over again. So we're not advocating team replacement by any means. We just kind of understand you're probably having a lot of difficulty finding skilled resources across the board, right? Caregivers, IT, et cetera, but specifically in IT for this discussion. And so if you think a little bit differently about how your team can be augmented, you might find some really, really good solutions out there. One more, unless something else comes in. We're lucky to have a talented IT team that is fully staffed. Would they be capable of zero trust or microsegmentation projects without tools? So yes, they're capable of doing it. They'll need tools of some sort, kind of standard networking tools. But the discussion should be framed more around what's the best use of their time. We talked to someone at a conference recently. By the way, it's great to be back in conferences, even if we have to wear masks. It's nice to have human interaction. Anyway, we talked to this person, and we were blown away by how much progress their team had made because they did a full microsegmentation project. It was about 5 of them. It took 18 months. And they were telling us what they did, and we were just, my colleague and I were blown away. It was great progress. But then the discussion turned to, was that worth 5 people's time for 18 months when you're kind of a critical care facility? and you might have been able to provide better focus someplace else. And they said at the time, we just didn't have an option. So I don't think it's about ability. Most people could do this with the right number of resources and tools. The question is more, is that the right focus? Or if you give them the right services like ours for device security, can we make them more efficient across the board? So think less about ability and more about best use of time for everyone there and resources. All right, more questions coming in. I love it. All right. When you say hospital under attack, are you referring to attacks to steal or ransom data that exploit via malware getting it through IT devices or via OT devices or both? Okay, good question. Yeah. So there's three types of devices that we see within healthcare environments. One is medical devices. So think like IV pumps and CT machines and MRIs. So they're providing medical care, but they're also connected to the internet. Those are a subset of IoT devices. So devices that are connected in some way, but may not be medical specific. So security cameras, smart door locks, things like that. And then the third is OT, which was mentioned there, which is operations technology. And OT is, think about a hospital as a big facility that happens to provide healthcare within it. So we're talking about the energy grid, the elevators, the HVAC systems, all those systems that just make a facility run and that you can't provide care in without them. So when we talk about attacks, we're talking about attacks across the board. So sometimes they come in through OT devices, sometimes they come in through medical devices. If you look at that Ponymon study that I referenced, those are focused, I believe that I believe is focused mostly on IoT devices, but they're coming in everywhere. The sad reality is that just because a device is in a healthcare environment does not mean it has an additional layer of security, and vulnerabilities exist all over the place. We have a rapid recap on our YouTube channel that discusses that I'd point you to as well. Next, what is the most attacked device in a hospital? Okay, cool. So we were doing, I'm going to tease a data report. We have a data report coming out soon. So we were doing a lot of analysis around this the other day. The most vulnerable devices we saw were IV pumps. And that's not a surprise because there's all kinds of known issues around IV pumps. And when you realize that IV pumps have there's thousands of IV pumps in even kind of smaller hospitals, or hundreds and thousands, I should say. It's no surprise that one issue can replicate really quickly across many of them because they're rolled out en masse. So in terms of the ones introducing the most risk, it's IV pumps just because of the sheer volume of them. The ones that we see attacked most commonly are often the imaging servers, right? They're running on old Windows machines and they hold a wealth of information, right? All those images that are supposed to be deleted once a radiologist or someone looks at them, quite often they just kind of sit there in the cache or they're backed up. And so what we've seen is PACS machines in particular have had a bunch of attacks against them. It doesn't mean that they're the most attacked machines, but we're seeing a really high volume of successful attacks against them. The other thing to remember is that attackers are business people. So their attack patterns are constantly changing and what they focus on is constantly changing. So again, we do have a report coming out that will describe that in more detail. I'm sure I missed at least one obvious thing in there, but we do have some data on that coming out soon. Cool. Let me see if there's anything else. No, I think that's it. Awesome questions. I think we got like 5 or 6 questions today. So good job. Again, thank you everyone for joining. If you do have any questions, reach out to myself, reach out to Will. Sorry, let me give you a good slide here. There we go. Reach out to myself, reach out to Will, and we will gladly answer them. So have a great day. We'll talk to everyone soon and take care.